Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder as I step out for a walk and deliver an episode to you while I stroll home. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good afternoon, listeners. It's a cloudy, kind of gloomy day here in suburban Chicago, although it is unseasonably warm. The last few days have been very cold. If you were following the 2022 weather cycle, last week we saw a violently cold storm that resulted in massive problems for people along the Great Lakes. Now, being a bit inland in Chicago, it wasn't so bad for us here, but we got a lot of snow and ice, and then it's now like 5 days later, and it's literally like 54 degrees right now. The ground is all wet, and it's cloudy overhead like it's gonna rain later, but it's a weird spot to be in, where just a few days ago we were talking about not being outside too long because it could literally be dangerous. So anyway, while I'm out doing that walk, I thought I would chat with you a little bit. And I was thinking about, before I forget, if you are not on the Board Game Geek forums very regularly, I have posted a 500th episode forum thread where you could go and let me know things that you think work really well about the podcast, or things that you think could be changed, or what's your favorite part, or what's your least favorite part. It's always helpful for me to think about as I imagine the next year of the podcast. Also, as a reminder, this is episode 498. After episode 500, I'm going to go on a brief hiatus for a couple weeks while I'm teaching my January term class, and then I'll be back in late January. So with that in mind, here's my episode for today. I was thinking about what it means to care about theme and be a Care Bear player simultaneously as a player. And so I thought I would talk about 4 ways that theme shapes gameplay for me, and also, or the sort of 4 things about how gameplay is shaped for me by theme, but then also how my preference for Care Bear play comes into effect in running through these themes. So I have sort of 4 segments that we'll start with. We're going to start with we'll move from negative to positive. So we're going to start with the negative. And these are things where I want to start with themes that I really dislike. So if you're a long-time listener to the podcast, you're going to probably be able to name these off the top of your head, but I'll talk a little bit about each one and where I struggle with them. The first thing is colonizing games. Games where the primary thing that you're doing is enacting the European history of colonization of non-white spaces, usually in an abstracted way that ignores the effect of that colonizing activity on the people who live there and doesn't take into account the experiences they've had. Now, for the bulk of the development of board gaming, the idea that one would have to think about that, or that one should think about that, was neglected or absent. Only in the last 10 years or maybe 15 years have we seen much conversation about it, and have we seen a movement away from using colonizing as a generic theme for an economic engine. I'd point to games like I never played Mombasa, and as much as I heard it was a great game, I never had any interest in playing Mombasa because it was about colonization. I feel the same way a little bit about Pax Pamir and about John Company. Both of these games are about colonizing powers, interacting with colonized people. And I recognize that these games represent a more complex view of the experience, but generally it's something I stay away from. That said, I do have a couple colonizing games in my collection. I really enjoy the game. I can't remember what it's called. Poor professionalism, Brendan. There's a game from Eggert Spiel where you are trying to decide whether you're getting goods or whether you either get blue cubes or red cubes, and you're playing a card, and the way that the cubes interact on the board depend on how many other people played that card. Boy, I can't remember what it's called right now. Look in the show notes if you're curious about that. It's a really good game, 15 to 20 minutes or maybe a half hour. Interesting mechanisms, annoying colonization theme. The other game that's in my collection that I sort of wrestle with is Struggle of Empires. This is a gift I got from a friend. It's a beautiful production of a game whose theme I don't enjoy, but at some point we'll play it, and it'll be a chance to think about and talk about that experience. But it's not ideal. The second kind of game that I generally will shy away from are games where characters are unreasonably or unnecessarily sexualized. Usually it's female characters sexualized in a way that is for the men's gaze. And there are games that I've heard are very good that I just don't want to play because of that theme. A classic example would be Geek and Sundry Tabletop did an episode about Tanto Kyurei, I think it's called, which is about hiring maids to work in your house, but they're all like busty anime maids, and I don't really like that idea for a board game, and I want to not be embarrassed to show the game to other people, and that is the case with that kind of game. The one game I had in my collection that happened with was I got a copy of Runebound 2nd edition after 3rd edition came out. I got 2nd edition on the used market, and there was a character that was literally in chainmail bikini, and I was just like, well, this is terrible. London Dread also had a very poor choice of female characters. You could either be literally a nun or a prostitute. Those were kind of your two options. It's possible that the prostitute was a burlesque dancer, but the game did not give you a clear sense either way, and it wasn't a sort of empowering burlesque dancer. It was, she might as well be a prostitute. So games that do that unthoughtfully are far less likely to be interesting to me. It's one of the things that will push me toward not buying a game, or I would need a lot more convincing to buy a game that trafficked in that imagery. So that would be the second thing. The third thing, theme-wise, that I don't like, I'm especially a lot more aware of games that do in unthoughtful cultural appropriation, right? So a game that represents a place without actually researching or talking to the people from that place. Now, this is one I've only more recently sort of become aware of, and as a result, those fingerprints are in my collection more, right? Like I have Altiplano, which as far as I know, Reiner Stockhausen did not consult with any people from South America as he was imagining this game, and I don't know how much history he researched. But there have been a number of other games that have represented different places without really very thoughtfully doing that, and that is something I'm more aware of now and looking to see people do well. So games that enact cultural appropriation, I would be skeptical of. All right, so those are three themes that make me cringe or not want to participate. On the other side, here's some dark themes that I really like. Can you guess the first one? This might be the most used example in the history of Pick Up and Deliver, and that is Anachrony. Anachrony is a really dark theme. Society is collapsing. You are one of these 4 factions. You're trying to recruit people from the capital to come be in your faction. The thing is, all the factions are like cults, and they're all horrible. When you go and read the backstory for these factions, they're all born of desperation and struggles for power, and as a result, they're all pretty nasty in different ways. And so it's kind of various different nasty cults that you're playing. And just the way that theme has developed, I find amusing and entertaining, and because it's in this sort of sci-fi fantasy future world, I don't mind it so much. In a similar way, the transition that Martin Wallace did from anarchist bombings of the 18th century or the 19th century into a study in Emerald where we're bombing Cthulhu elder gods, I love it. That is a theme I delight in, and the mixing of fiction and fact there works really well and becomes a theme that I enjoy, even if generally I wouldn't like that. Two more thematic things that I really like in games. These are more nuanced elements of games, but I really like the way that it's structured in the game versus, normally I wouldn't like that. The Arctic Scavengers Leaders expansion gives you a card with a special power that you can use to help give your tribe an advantage. And one of the leaders is called the Butcher, I think. And the picture is this guy sitting in front of what looks like a big bowl of gazpacho. It's like a big bowl of red liquid. And his power, I love when the mechanism creates a narrative like this. His power is to take a character from your deck, discard them from the game, trash them, and gain 3 food, which you can then use to recruit people. So this idea that he has this big supply of food to bring in new strong members. But where's he getting that food? You're discarding members to get the food. He's a cannibal. And whether the other people are not, they're cannibals too. It's Like, it's a really well-developed idea. It's kind of funny in the context of this sort of post-apocalyptic Arctic wasteland, and it's really fun. So small nuances like that I find very compelling and fun. And then finally, of course, the theme of the Bloody Inn is an example of just a great theme that I enjoy, where the gameplay itself is relatively straightforward. It is a straightforward Euro tableau management, resource management game with this overlay of this theme that's just grotesque and delightful, and this terrifying art. And I love the interaction of the two that makes for a really fun game experience, even as the theme itself is pretty grotesque. So there's a couple examples of like a theme that I wouldn't normally like, that in game form becomes really delightful for me. All right, so as I think about these mechanisms that lead to story, that does remind me of a few things that come from, that sort of are shaped by this Care Bear experience that I have. The fact that I don't like to do things that sort of directly attack my friends in a game where that isn't the main point of the game. Like, I don't mind a game that has direct conflict at its core. I'll talk about that in a minute. But games where it's just a very minor part of it, I generally don't enjoy. So a couple examples of that. I don't like to play the Terraforming Mars cards that like take away other people's resources. Those are not my favorite. I don't like to play the Fool card in Everdell, which is a skunk who takes up one of your building slots. And the fact that it's -2 points, I don't mind so much, but in Everdell you have 15 building slots and they're often very tightly constrained, and your ability to use them comes down to how well you plan, and you only get 15. There's only a couple cards that don't go in that tableau and kind of get to be extra, but for the most part, you get 15. So if you can, at the right moment, drop the Fool on somebody, which the Fool is a skunk in a fool's hat, who gives you -2 points, but more importantly, takes up one of the slots in your city. That can be a brutal turnaround of the game, especially if they've got their last couple turns planned out. They know what they're going to do with the last slot or two. Then you put the Fool in there, it really can throw people for a loop. So I almost never play it because I don't find it fun. The same goes for in Agricola, if there is a farm animal that nobody's been taking and it's been building up, and I don't yet have the ability to eat the farm animal, sometimes players will occasionally take an animal just to let it run free so your opponent can't get it and make food out of it. That's not a move I'm ever going to do, because it just feels so antithetical to what Agricola should be about, which is trying to survive. So the idea of actively doing something to try to hurt the other player in order to win, like I want to win by making the best farm, not by burning down your farm. In the same way, and it's a little different too, but in the same way I feel like the rainfall mechanism in Egizia is what turned me off of the game. Like the fact that to play well, there are times where you have to actively reduce the amount of rain that's going to fall if your opponents have bought too heavily into the light farm fields. I just don't find that fun. I don't want to use my turn making it harder for the other people to do well, especially in a very tight resource management game. Now, if I take the spot you wanted to go to, that feels like a different kind of backstabbery to me, as long as I'm taking it because I want it, not just because you want it. So I find that part pretty unpleasant in Egizia. And then finally, there are a couple cards, like in Through the Ages, there are a couple cards I just won't take. Like there is an enslavement card that you can get. You draw a certain number of military cards each round. One of the military cards is enslavement. I will never play that card. I end up discarding it when it's time to discard it. But I don't want my civilization to have been built on the benefit of slavery, economic benefit of slavery. Similarly, there is a Christopher Columbus card that is mechanically pretty simple, but ethically and morally, I don't want to play a Christopher Columbus card. I don't want him to be part of my civilization. It's not to say I haven't ever played it, but I don't really want to play it. So, yeah, I don't know. These feel like weird and interesting things to have happen because they're part of the game experience. They're meant to be mechanical, and the theme is meant to come along after. But if the theme is too reprehensible, I don't want to use that theme. Hence, those things I don't want to do or won't do. And then finally, I thought it wouldn't hurt to talk a little bit about what are some things in themes that I normally wouldn't want to do, but in the right circumstances, I do want to do them, and I find them delightful and fun. Now, the epitome example of this, as I think about games where this sort of thing happens, is a Game of Thrones. Now, Game of Thrones is a brutal, cooperative game where you are, or a brutal competitive game where you are doing area control and you're fighting against a variety of different opponents in order to try to take control of the castles. It comes from an IP that is sort of legendarily vicious, in which characters could die at any given moment and things are incredibly brutal. So it shouldn't be a surprise that a big part of a Game of Thrones is just manipulating people and sort of like twisting the knife at the right moment. And it's not that I necessarily find that fun to do, and I would prefer not to do it, but when I've played, there's almost inevitably a point where the constrictions of the game require me to do that or basically forfeit the game. And there's no mechanism for forfeiting, nor for like joining forces with someone else in a real way. So often then I'll betray somebody right around the time I think they're going to betray me, maybe one step before, if I can manage it. And I find that fun. But I only find it fun because it's in the context of a game where everybody knows that's what you're going to do. The second game that I would put as an example in that way that is fun to be vicious with is Mall of Horror. In Mall of Horror, or I guess City of Horror is the one I'm familiar with. In City of Horror, you are trapped in buildings in a city full of zombies, and you have to throw people out of the buildings in order to survive, and often you do that by outvoting them and then tossing them to the zombies to help your people survive. And it is a brutally tight game with vicious mechanisms and a setup where there's no way for everybody to survive. Some people are going to have to get thrown to the zombies. You just don't want it to be your people. And again, I have a good time with City of Horror because I know what to expect and I know what it's doing. So that one I like to point to as a good vicious game that I enjoy. Another one, which I've talked about a number of times on here, is Carl Chudik's Innovation. Innovation is a delightfully aggressive game in which there's 3 game states. You are progressing toward building up your civilization through a combination of cards and card play. 2, you have achieved some sort of leverage over your opponent and you are using it to metaphorically kick them in the face as many times as you can before they manage to wiggle out of the benefit that you have, or the hold that you have over them. Or 3, they've got a hold over you and are doing the same to you. Those are really the only states in Innovation that if you're not willing to do the thing where you go after them because you find the best solution to you getting to win is to hold them down, well, you got to do it. If you don't, you're going to lose. Now, I will put a caveat here. I've only played Innovation as a 2-player game. I may once have played it 3 players, but it was long enough ago, I don't remember. But Innovation as a 3-player game is going to be a totally different animal because if 2 of you are attacking each other relentlessly, the third person can just kind of waltz to victory maybe. Although often the game works like if you're in the lead in one thing and you do an attack, it's going to hit everybody who's not also in the lead. So it's a game that keeps everybody involved. But Carl Chudik's Innovation is the height of that sort of meanness. I want to point to the culmination of a thing I didn't want to do, a thing I did because the game expected it, and a thing that made me feel bad because I'm a Care Bear, is Dead of Winter. I know I've told this story in the podcast before, but here goes again. One time I was playing a game of Dead of Winter, I got the Betrayer card. And it was a very tough game. We were working really hard to survive. I played it straight the whole time. I didn't sabotage anything. We were going, and we were on our way to winning. We were two rounds away from winning. We had a good plan in order to win. And then I was the last player. And if you remember Dead of Winter, the way the turn order progresses, you go last player and then you're first player in the next round. So you have this opportunity where you get 2 turns in a row, and using those turns can be just brutal. And that's what I did. I destroyed our lovely little shelter and caused all sorts of trouble and won the game by destroying the game for everybody else, using those 2 turns in a row. And I felt horrible, like just horrible. I was glad to win, but I didn't have fun. And it seemed like everybody else was pretty spoiled. Their experience was pretty spoiled by it as well. So that sort of points to the downside of these games where it asks you to do something you don't want to do. Sometimes the consequences are worse than you'd like. So I'm curious, what are some games that fit one of the categories I've laid out for you here? Head over to Board Game Geek Guild 3269 and join the conversation there. I'd love to hear from you. As I said, we're almost to the end of the season, so if you have any comments or thoughts about the podcast, please do head over there and share those as well. If you want to send me a direct message, I'm Wombat929 on BoardGameGeek or Brendan at rattleboxgames.com. Thanks for joining me on my walk today. I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.